some musician when I went to conservatory was listening that. It,
Yeah, you don't think about that when they live stream.
yeah, in my ancient with my fingers, it's okay.
Okay.
Because it hurts, like, all the stuff.
Do you have arthritis?
Yeah,
That's what
irritates.
happens when you get
And my
old.
mom. And she was, well, doesn't matter what I do, it's whatever. We couldn't accept.
So much enjoyed your playing today. Find somebody. I can always cross my fingers and hope it's not right.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב, הנה מה טוב, יאללה לה, יאללה לה 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 לה. הנה מה טוב, הנה מה טוב, יאללה לה, יאללה לה 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 לה. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Congregation Ormi, especially if it's your first time here ever or just in a long while. Welcome also to those who are participating from home through the live stream. And a very special welcome to our guest speaker and friends from the Virginia Holocaust Museum and Violins of Hope program. We're very happy to have you here with us tonight. We begin our service together on the bottom of page 1, the Tree of Hope. There is even hope for a tree cut down, that it will sprout again, that its shoots will not cease, even if its root has grown old in the ground, and its stump seems to have died in the soil. At the scent of water, this tree can still bud and send out new branches like a young plant. I'd like to invite up Susan Miller to light our Shabbat candles on page 4.
All the stars are hidden, and the moon is dark tonight. In the wide expanse of heaven, there is not one ray of light. It is up to us to kindle Shabbat candles in the dark. The light begins with you and me. We need only make one spark. Soon the room will glow with a light that does not cease. May it overflow throughout the world with hope and joy and peace. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. At this point in our service, we think of the week that is past, and we hold on to all of the good things from this past week. So if you had an experience that inspired gratitude, if you have some good news to share, no matter how big or how small, I invite you to share that joy with the community now. Yeah, Pat?
I got to see my eldest grandson on his 19th.
Wonderful. Happy birthday to your grandson. Ariana?
My birthday tomorrow.
Happy birthday. It's a good time of year for birthdays. Yeah, Susan?
Our son Seth got a new job.
Mazel tov on the new job. That's wonderful. We thank God for all of these blessings, including the blessing of simply being alive for this moment in time with the words of Shehecheyanu on page 5. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehecheyanu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehecheyanu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh Amen. And we continue in the middle of page 6 with daily goodness. Every day may not be good, but there is something good in every day. It is a mitzvah to search for this glimmer of goodness and this spark of holiness each day. We continue with Lecha Dodi, celebrating the holiness of Shabbat, on page 7. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela, Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Shamor v'zachor b'dibor echad, Hishmi'anu el hamiuchad, Adonai echad u'shemo echad, L'shem u'tiferet v'litila. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha, Ki hi mekor habracha, Merosh mikedem nesucha, Sof maaseh b'machshava tchila. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Hitoreri, Ki va'orech kumi ori, Uri shir daberi, Kevod Adonai alaich nigla. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, P'nei Shabbat nekabela. And we rise together as a community, face the entrance to symbolically welcome in the presence of Shabbat. Boi v'shalom ateret bala, gam besimcha ubetzola, toch emunei am segula, boi chala, boi chala. Lecha dodi likrat kala, P'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, P'nei Shabbat nekabela. We continue at the bottom of page 8, and still I rise. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise. And we remain risen for the Baruch Hu, the official call to worship, at the top of page 9. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Ya la 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 la. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. HaMevorach, HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. Please be seated. Ma'ariv Aravim. When the darkness of night descends, do not despair at the absence of the sun. Look instead for the steady glow of stars, the little lights of hope that are most visible only in the times of the greatest darkness. These lights, with their constellations and coordinates, arranged carefully by the Eternal, will be the very map that guides you from darkness back to hope and light. Baruch atah Adonai Hama'ariv Aravim. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, who brings on the evening twilight. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Borei yom v'layla, golel or mipnei choshech, golel or mipnei choshech, v'choshech mipnei or. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Roll into dark, roll into light. Night becomes day, day turns to night. Please rise for the Shema, the bottom of page 10. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Mishim kevod malchuto leolam vaed. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Please be seated. Continue the top of page 11. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol lavavcha ubechol nafshecha ubechol me'adecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinatam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha v'derech uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha uv'shartam leot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot b'neinecha uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uv'isharecha leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'tem kedoshim le'Elohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim lihiyot lachem le'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem. And we continue in the middle of page 12 with I believe. I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love even when I cannot feel it. I believe in God even when God is silent. This is found written on a cellar wall in Cologne, Germany during the Holocaust. We continue our service with Mi Chamocha on the bottom of page 13. Ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 ya la 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 mi chama chaba elim Adonai mi kama chaneta bakodesh nora tehilato seifele nora tehilato seifele. And we continue on page 15 near the middle of the page with Vishamru. Vishamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם אותי לעולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם בששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם וביום השביעי שבת וינפש שבת וינפש שבת וינפש ושמרו בני ישראל את לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. We continue on the top of page 16. Prayer is a step on which we rise from the self we are to the self we wish to be. Prayer affirms the hope that no reality can crush, the aspiration that can never acknowledge defeat. Please rise for our central prayer, the Amidah. Adonai sefatai tiftachu fi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your glory. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Leah, v'Elohei Rachel, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor ve'hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, ve'konei hakol, ve'zocher chastei avot ve'imahot, u'mevi geula lifnei bneihem, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן. ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם בעזרת שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל, אתה רב להושיע. מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים. סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות, ומי דומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה, ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לחיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי הכל. And please be seated. We continue with a quiet moment for personal prayer or reflection. Page 18. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki ata hu melech Adon lechol hashalom. Ki ata lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. V'tov be'einecha levarech et Amcha Yisrael bechol עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. שלום רב על ישראל עמך tasim leolam, tasim leolam, tasim leolam. At this point in our service, we think of loved ones who are in need of healing. Tonight, we think especially of Beth Levine, Rabbi Jerry Levy, Jean Sanders, and Sue Shires. If there are other loved ones whose healing we wish to pray for tonight, please share their names aloud or in the comments section. With the power of community, we pray for their refuah shlema, their complete healing of body and or spirit, with the words of Misha Berach at the bottom of page 20. Misha Berach avotenu mikor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misheberach imotenu, mikor habracha. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. I'd like to invite up Beth Casey to share some brief announcements on behalf of the board.
Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for making the High Holy Days so successful. It was truly a blessing. Just some announcements. There will be no Torah study tomorrow. We will begin Torah study again on September the 25th. That's a week from this Saturday. It starts at 11 o'clock. We meet in person here, and it will also be available virtually as well. September the 21st, we begin Sukkot. I would ask that you watch your emails from Orami for further announcements. Religious school will begin on September the 26th. We have class meetups from 11 to 12. And my wish for you this evening is that each and every one of you have a wonderful and restful week. And that's the announcements I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. We continue our service on page 22 with Aleinu. Please rise for the Aleinu prayer. Aleinu leshabeach ladon hakol, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות אדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. אמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד. At this point in our service, we think of loved ones who have passed away recently or at this time in years past. Tonight we remember with love Maida Levine, mother of David Levine, Jules Levine, father of David Levine, Sarah Simon, sister of David Levine, Hilda Lizelle, mother of Lisa Levine, Maurice Bud Lizelle, father of Lisa Levine, and the Yartsites of Jay Bison, longtime member of ORME, Leah Cohen, grandmother of Deborah Cohen, Jules Foyer, father of Stan Foyer, Robert Heller, brother-in-law of Beth Jones, Susan Hurt, longtime member of ORME, Arthur Levine, father of Scott Levine, Walter D. Nelson Sr., grandfather of Nancy Nelson, Martin Nordlinger, father of Joanne Nordlinger, Ann Presser, cousin of Judy Katzen, Joan Shunis, mother of Dan Siegel, and Seymour Simon, father of Alex Simon. Are there other loved ones we wish to remember tonight? Zichronam Libracha, may their memories always be a blessing. We continue with the Mourner's Kaddish on page 23. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute, b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehe shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olomei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha brichu. Le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehe shlama Rabba min shemaya, v'chayim alenu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, alenu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn, and may we be a source of comfort for all who are bereaved, and let us say, amen. Please be seated. We conclude our service tonight with Eli, Eli, found on the top of page 25. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hachol v'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam, hachol v'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam. Eli, Eli, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. It is now my honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Avshalom Weinstein. Avshalom is a third-generation Israeli violin maker who works with his father Amnon on an incredible project called Violins of Hope. This project began in the late 1980s when a man who played the violin in Auschwitz visited his father Amnon and asked if he would restore his violin. This man had not played the violin since leaving the concentration camp and wanted to get it restored for his grandson. Avshalom's father Amnon lovingly restored that first violin. From that day on, he had a new mission in life. He tracked down and restored scores of other violins played by Jews in ghettos, forest hideouts, and concentration camp orchestras. For years, he worked alone in a cramped basement workshop in Tel Aviv, Israel. Then his son, Avshalom, our guest speaker tonight, added 2 more helping hands with this project. Working together, they've now restored more than 60 violins as a way to reclaim their lost heritage, give a voice to the victims, and reinforce positive messages of hope and harmony. Please join me in welcoming Avshalom Weinstein.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, but I'll stand you correct. I'm sorry. The first violin that you were talking about was brought to my father in 1979. And the story behind it, it was given to a person by the original owner. This guy worked for the original owner in South Africa. And the original owner was one of the people who played on the way to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. As you might know if you've seen me in other places, I know at least 2 of you have seen me. I honestly don't remember what I spoke about on Sunday, but the Nazis had musicians all over. And one of the ways they used musicians was to deceive and to try and calm the people once they arrived to the camps, or even once they had to walk to the gas chambers. And this person, he played on the way to the gas chambers, and before he passed away, he gave this violin to the guy who worked with him, or for him, I don't remember. And he was the one who brought the violin to my father. And when he brought it to my father, it was either 1979 or 1980, we just saw the article which was written then. This is how I remember the year. When my father opened the violin, there was black ashes inside. Most probably from the crematorium, but as you can imagine, it's not really possible to go and check. This is not something you go and check. And when my father finished repairing that violin, he gave it back to the new owner, and until today his son is playing on it. Now you have to understand, when my father grew up, he grew up alone. My father's family was him, my aunt, his younger sister, and their 2 parents, and that was it. When my grandfather and my grandmother, when they immigrated to Israel in 1938, my grandfather was one of 11. Only one of his brothers survived. Later on, he moved here to the United States. My grandmother family, they were 7 or 8 people. We don't know because both of them never said one word about their families. None of my grandmother's family survived. Not a single one. If you ever come to the workshop, I can show you we have suitcases full of letters from before the war and from the beginning of the war until the Nazis invaded Russia, that their probably brothers, sisters, cousins, we don't even know. They send them letters asking them to try and get them certificates so they can come to Israel. But unfortunately, it was simply impossible. And my late aunt, she made an estimation that probably about 400 of our family members were killed during the war. We have no idea when and where. Most probably it was around July, August 1941 in the killing pits around Vilna. But there is simply no documentation. When the war ended, one of my father's friends, who was a doctor that he knew him from Vilna from before the war, he came to my grandfather and he told him what happened to the family. And that was the day that my grandfather got his first heart attack. He survived. We have in our family, in my father's side of the family, the pump works very well, but the plumbing is not so good, unfortunately. And in the 80s, my grandfather went to the son of this doctor, who was one of the best heart doctors in Israel. He was the head of Shiba, of Tel HaShomer Hospital, the biggest one, the heart department. He went to him, and my grandfather went for a check, and the guy told him, he said, "Listen, Moishele, your heart is great, but your veins are a little bit too closed. So you have, those times it was only open heart surgery. My grandmother, who of course knew everything better than anyone else, said, well, he's too young, he doesn't know what he says. Unfortunately, my grandfather died 3 years later from a heart attack. And this is in a very short about their families. As you can imagine, in Israel, families of survivors were rather very, very small. Everybody lost someone. Everybody, every single family lost people during the war. And after 1945, when survivors were coming to Israel, there was a very strong ban in Israel on everything German. They wouldn't even say the word Germany on the radio. I don't know how much you know or remember, but there was a very big fight in Israel, and it was a very big problem when Ben Gurion asked the German government to pay reparations to the survivors. It was a big shock. Many people didn't want to get this money. It was a big scandal, but in the end, they started getting the money. And many people from the orchestra and musicians who were in Israel, who came in the 30s, who were establishing basically the Palestine Orchestra, what is today the Israeli Philharmonic. They came after 1945-46 to my grandfather, and they told him something very simple. They said, we have this German violin, we don't want to play it anymore. Either you buy it from us or we destroy it. Now, my grandfather in those times, he already knew that he basically lost all his family, all my grandmother's family, and he bought what he could. He knew that there is no way that he's going to be able to sell them, because if nobody wants to buy German instruments, how can you sell them later? And we got stuck, in a way, with a beautiful collection of excellent German instruments. Until in 1991, my father had an apprentice coming from Dresden. Dresden, of course, was Eastern Germany, part of the Soviet Union. And when this person, Daniel Schmidt, when he came to Israel and he saw the collection that we had, he asked my father, he said, how could you get these instruments in Israel? Tel Aviv in the 40s, Tel Aviv in the 40s was 2 blocks and a desert, basically. There was nothing there. So my father told him the story about how they established the Palestine Orchestra, how Huberman brought the musicians alongside with their families. If you will go to the Virginia Holocaust Museum, we have one of the violins of the concertmeister, one of the first concertmeisters of the Palestine Orchestra. There is a photo of his violin, and also a photo of all the musicians alongside their families in Tel Aviv in around 1936. Almost 1,000 people that Huberman managed to get them to Israel with the certificates. Now, the reason that Huberman needed a very good concertmeister, this I can say here in a synagogue very easy. We all know that if you have 5 Jewish people in a room and you ask them something, you'll get at least 8 different answers. And what Huberman did, he collected the best musicians from Europe. If you look on some of the first programs from the Palestine Orchestra, you'll have the name of the person, his position, and the old position he had in Europe. So this one was the leader of that. The other one was the leader of this section in that orchestra. They were fantastic musicians. So many musicians with so many great opinions. You needed someone who can actually rule them. And he chose one of the first concertmeister was one of his students, Heinrich Haftel, the guy that we have his violin in the collection. And this is how they played. It was then one of the very best orchestras in the world. And although in Tel Aviv there were not much places to play concerts, they usually, I think, in the beginning they just played in open air. And my father told me that there was once a concert, I don't remember who it was, it might have been Hefetz who came to play in Israel in late 1920s. About quarter of Tel Aviv came to hear the concert. So everybody wanted to have classical music. Now, after Daniel Schmidt, our apprentice in the 90s, when he saw the collection that we had, he asked my father to come to Germany and to give a lecture on how those instruments arrived to Israel. It took Daniel about 3 years to convince my father. And the first, what is today Violins of Hope, the first lecture was in Dresden in 1999. And after that, my father spoke on a radio show in Israel. And this was, in a way, kind of a Facebook radio show. It started in the 40s. People will go on air, say, my name is this and that, I'm coming from this and that village or city, and I'm looking for my mother, my father, my brothers, and they would leave a name or a name, phone number, or an address, and people will get back to them if they are lucky enough and tell them what actually happened to their families. This is how people got in touch with each other in those times. There was no Facebook, no Google, no other options. And in 1999, my father spoke on one of these shows, and he asked people if by chance they have an instrument with a story connected to the war. The next morning, we got the first phone call of a guy. He had his uncle's violin, and it's a very unique instrument, not because it has a story with the war. It also has a beautiful Star of David inlaid in the back, and it has a label in Hebrew. And the label says, I made this violin for my loyal friend, Mr. Shimon Korngold, Warsaw, 1924, Yaakov Zimmerman. Yaakov Zimmerman was one of probably 5 or 6 Jewish violin makers who worked in Europe before the war. I don't know if the name Ida Handel says anything to you, the legendary violinist. She told me and my father that she remembers going to Yaakov Zimmerman in Warsaw when she was a child. And she said that he was already then probably in his 70s. We never heard anything about Yaakov Zimmerman after the war. Most probably he died either in the ghetto or sometime. There is simply no records of him. Shimon Korngold himself, the owner of the violin, he was a wealthy industrialist in Warsaw. He tried to escape, but unfortunately, he was caught in Tashkent. He became sick, died in Tashkent. And in 1947, one of his best friends, he came to the Korngold family in Jerusalem, knocked on the door, and asked them if they knew who Shimon was. The guy who opened the door is the same guy who called us, Nadir. He said, yes, I know the person. This was my uncle. And basically the only thing that was left from their uncle was the violin and a photo of him playing on this instrument at home. Now the next name will probably not tell you much, Michel Schwalbe. But Michel Schwalbe was one of the best violinists later on. And my father called him and he asked Michel if he remembers Yaakov Zimmerman, and because he grew up in Warsaw. And he told my father, he said yes. He remembered that when he was a child, he used to go to Yaakov Zimmerman to get his instruments fixed because they didn't have any money. Everything was given to him for free. And he also knew Shimon Korngold, sorry. And he told my father that because they were so poor, his parents were too ashamed to bring the violin teacher home. And he used to have his violin lesson at Shimon Korngold's house. He later on became to be the concertmaster of the Berlin Philharmonic. And even though Karajan was the main conductor and a very, very enthusiastic Nazi supporter, his favorite concertmaster was Michel Schwalbe. And until today, some of the best recordings that you can hear is when Michel Schwalbe was leading the orchestra. He had, of course, to run away from Germany, but after the war, he got his old position back in Berlin Philharmonic, and this is where he stayed until he retired. Now, there are many, 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 many different stories. I mean, we have instruments which were in camps, instruments that we know very detailed history, instruments we know a bit less. When the time is passing so much, It's very hard to get more and more instruments because, unfortunately, most of the survivors passed away. And many of them, many of them never said one word. And if your parents or grandparents, if they didn't tell you their stories, you'll never know it. And if you'll find a violin at home, you cannot connect it to anything. Many of those instruments, unfortunately, were lost even before the war was ending. As you know, most of the camps were sent on death marches into Germany. And the last thing those people needed to take with them was one more thing to carry, one more thing that can make them tired and maybe get them killed. I'm sure everybody knows the book of Elie Wiesel, The Night, right? He's talking about his friend Julik, that during the death march, one night he took out his violin, played a little bit of the Beethoven violin concerto, and in the morning they found him dead with his violin broken. But I'm sure most of you don't know that Elie Wiesel himself used to play violin. One of my mother's best friend was one of his assistants before he passed away, and he told us that Elie Wiesel, when he was growing up, he had violin lessons, but he had a very unique system for a violin lesson. He used to go to the teacher with a bottle of a drink, and when the lesson started, the teacher started pouring, and the lesson will end when the bottle was empty. He didn't continue. I'm not so sure why. But this was his part with violin playing. So almost every single house in Eastern Europe had people playing violin. All the klezmers, all this amazing tradition. It was basically extinct after the war because klezmers had a big problem. Because they were self-taught, they didn't know how to read notes. And if you couldn't read notes, you couldn't play in the orchestras in the camps. And those who had the chance to play in the orchestras, they had a small advantage on others. Some survived, some unfortunately died, of course, but because the Nazis needed them, they had a small edge. There is a very famous story about a woman called Alma Rosé. She was coming from a very known family of musicians. Her father was the leader of the Vienna Philharmonic, Arnold Rosé, for many years, until, of course, in 1938, when the Nazis took over Austria, he was literally thrown away from the orchestra, even though that him and his whole family converted to be Christians years before the war. Her uncle was Gustav Mahler, the famous composer, and before they left Austria, Alma had a small ensemble of women, and they used to play all over Europe, very successful ensemble. And after they moved to London, after a while, Alma wanted to go back and play concerts. She thought that she's going to be safe because she considered herself to be Christian. Unfortunately, she was caught in Europe during the war, and the Nazis sent her to Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. She became the head of the orchestra, the women orchestra there, and she was kind of, if you can call someone a celebrity in a concentration camp, she was basically a celebrity. The Nazis treated her very well. They would even address her as Frau Rosé, Mrs. Rosé, when they would call her. She made the women work very, very hard, practice all the time and learn new pieces, because she believed that if they'll play well and work hard, the Nazis will keep them alive. And she was right. They not only kept them alive because they treated Alma so nicely, the only barracks that had its own toilets were the women orchestra barrack in Birkenau. No other barracks anywhere in any camp had its own toilets. There is a story about a woman who was very sick. She was sent to the clinic. As you can imagine, if you get to a clinic in a concentration camp, it's a one-way ticket. And one day, Joseph Mengele, the doctor, he took a trip in the clinic. He saw this woman laying down in very bad condition, And he asked the nurse, he said, "Why is she still there?" And the nurse said, "Well, she belongs to the orchestra." And he walked away, and the woman survived. Alma herself, unfortunately, did not survive. She passed away 2 or 3 months before the liberation, but only 2 women from the whole orchestra didn't make it. A friend of ours, Raphael Walfish, a fantastic cellist, his mother was sent to Auschwitz when she was 16, also a cellist. She became a member of the orchestra, and a few months later her sister arrived to the camp, and the guy who admitted her sister was the same guy who admitted her. And he looked on her sister and he said, "I've seen these sandals before. There was another girl here who has the same sandals." And this is how the 2 sisters were reunited, and both survived. Now I'll tell you a little bit about my mother's side of the family. During the schools that I spoke to today and yesterday, most of them haven't seen this movie, but you might have seen a movie called Defiance from 2008 with Daniel Craig, Liv Schreiber, and Jamie Bell. Anyone seen it? You did. You did. That's it? Only 3 people? So this is the story of my grandfather and his 2 brothers. My grandparents, from my mother's side, they lived in what was then eastern Poland. Today it's Belarusia. They lived in a small village. Don't believe everything you've seen in the movie, it's wrong. It's not a documentary, it's Hollywood. My grandparents knew each other before the war. They knew each other very well because some of their sisters and brothers got married, and some of them even were lucky enough to come here to the United States before the war. And when Nazi Germany, when they invaded Russia in June 1941, my grandfather decided that rather living in a ghetto, he will go and live in the woods. They knew the forest very well because this was basically their backyard. Now, unlike in the movie, my grandfather, he knew my grandmother before. He was in love with my grandmother before the war, but my grandmother was the 11th child, and she was a young and spoiled little kid. She didn't want to marry a village boy, and when the war started, they made a deal. And the deal was that if he saves her and her parents, she will marry him. And not only he saved her, he also gave her a gun as a wedding gift. Those who've seen the movie have seen their wedding. I'm not so sure it actually happened like that, but they did get married sometime. And this was the reason why my mother, unlike the vast majority of the kids, actually had grandparents after the war. Because grandparents did not exist in Israel. When my father went to first grade in 1946 in Israel, there were 36 kids in the class. Only one of them had grandparents. He came from Yemen. My grandparents, they fought in the woods for 3 years. And unlike most of the partisan camps, they took in everybody. Women, children, older people, anyone they could find. They had to fight the locals, of course, because, as you probably know, these areas were not so much Jewish-friendly. They were rather anti-Semitic before the war and very anti-Semitic during the war. They had a very high price on their heads the whole war, but they survived. And in the end, in July 1944, when the Russian army came over and released them, 1,232 Jewish people marched out of the woods. My grandfather, unfortunately, was later on drafted to the Russian army. He was killed, we have no idea where, either in Germany or Poland. And my grandmother, she was pregnant when she heard it. She decided that after the war that living in Soviet Russia is not exactly the dream communist place that she fought of before the war. She took my mother, who was a few months old, and her parents, and started running to Western Germany. One of the times they were in a pig train doing the way west, and there was an inspection coming in. So my grandmother started kicking all the pigs, so they'll scream, and nobody could hear my mother screaming. They arrived to a displaced people camp in Western Germany, not far away from Munich. And after spending there between 1 or 2 years, they arrived to Israel, and this is where my grandmother stayed until she passed away. So in a very, very short, this is a little bit about our project, about my mother's side of the family. If you have any questions, please ask.
Did you bring one of the violins?
Yes, I did bring one of the violins. It's I'll open it up 1 second. Most of the violins that we have are either on display or being played. This violin, as you can see here, this is a klezmer instrument. You see the beautiful Stars of David inlaid. It's a mother of pearl inlay. These instruments were made in a place which is the border between Germany and the Czech Republic. These are very, very simple instruments. They were done very cheap, and basically, this is what those people could afford. The vast majority of the people in Eastern Germany, in Eastern Europe, they didn't have money to buy good instruments. This is what they could get. This place made instruments with Stars of David, with crosses, everything you can imagine. Now, lately I've seen few articles here in the United States saying that these are rather sheriff stars than Magen David, but I'll tell you one thing. I know the place it was made, and if you would go there to the people who made it and tell them, you know, in the United States there are those sheriffs and they have the same stars, they'll tell you, yes, but where is the United States? In Europe, in 1900, Star of David meant Jewish. Nothing else. Trust me. Most probably the last thing they would think of would be a sheriff somewhere in the United States. And no offense, yeah? But those people had no idea where United States is. And as I said, the klezmers, unfortunately, those tradition was extinct after the war. There is a revival of klezmer music here in the United States, a little bit in Israel, but in Eastern Germany, in Eastern Europe, even though that today in Poland they say, yeah, we have lots of klezmer music, it's not really klezmer music. It's music, sounds like klezmers, but this is not klezmer music, not like it used to be. No questions?
That violin seems small, but I don't really know music for instruments. Is it smaller than a violin that would be played now?
No, this is a full-size violin. Full-size violin is is between 13 inches and 7/8 to 14.5 inch. So this would be a full size.
My daughter plays violin in high school. She's either first or second. She doesn't play anything.
Yeah. You don't want me to play. Me and the violin, we decided many years ago that it's better for the human beings that I'll stop.
How many violins do you have now?
We have about 87 instruments in the collection. But like I said, with so much time passing, there were thousands upon thousands of instruments. But most of them are gone. Either you need to go and ask Putin where they are, if he might know, or basically all the villages around the camps in Poland. This is where you'll find them. The vast majority of the survivors, they either didn't take anything with them on the death marches, or they simply got rid of it, not to get the memories. So thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom. If you want to come and take photos from up close, the violins here.
Shabbat Shalom. We're going to go out on the patio for Kiddush and Motzi. If you want to learn more about this project, check your email and the Facebook links. Shabbat Shalom.
Was Leningrad, but now it's St. Petersburg.
mentioned some of you ancestors from Belarus.
Yeah. Nowy Budek.
Budek?
Nowy Budek.
Nowy.
Białystok.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Because mine came from Svetilovich, Gomel, and near the Minsk,
Yeah.
far away.
Yeah, this is someone who had too much time on this.
Well, you know, a lot of instruments, a lot of the lower priced instruments these days are made in Czechoslovakia.
No,
And well, in China. Yeah, it depends. So, it was really nice that you were here tonight. Yeah, I think.
my father did the violin because the label Antonio Stradivari made in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
My father said, "What do you want to know?" He said, "Everything is written. It's made in Czechoslovakia." He said, "Yeah, maybe he did it on a vacation." He said, "In 1700, Czechoslovakia did not exist."
Yes, that's right.
So, I'm wondering, the Jewish craftsmen who actually made violins, did they work in the German shops like in the 1900s?
They had their own workshops, and they probably might have been working. The ones that